Existence fractures the moment we realize the world will not answer us. A person can stand in the rush of modern life, surrounded by speed, sound, purpose, yet feel a hollow space open quietly beneath their feet. That silence is not emptiness. It is the first signal that the universe will not explain itself. And here, the central question pierces through the noise. What happens when a human being discovers that meaning will not be handed to them? The absurd is born exactly in that gap, in the collision between our hunger for clarity and the vast indifference of the world around us. It is not nihilism, not chaos, but a mirror. It reflects our longing, not the universe's promise. Before we continue, you are gently invited to subscribe, leave a like, and share a comment. This channel is a small space for grounding and reflection, created for those who seek a calmer way of understanding themselves and the world. If you feel comfortable, tell us where you are and what time it is for you. Your presence here matters, and your words help weave a quiet community across the distance. May what follows bring you ease, clarity, and a softer place to rest your thoughts. To live humanly in 2025 is to stand before this silence without collapsing, without inventing illusions to soften it, without surrendering to despair. The task is harder now because the world moves faster, promises more, and explains less. Yet this is precisely why a new way of living must emerge, a way marked by lucidity, courage, and the refusal to be crushed by the absence of cosmic guarantees. The absurd does not imprison us. It reveals the space where our freedom begins. And from this threshold, the path opens toward the first chapter, the moment of awakening, when the familiar world becomes strangely distant and the true inner journey finally begins. The familiar world does not crumble with noise. It crumbles with silence. It happens in the most ordinary moment. A person stands in the middle of the modern rush, surrounded by motion, surrounded by voices, surrounded by endless tasks, and suddenly the world feels distant, as if life has shifted half a step to the left. Everything looks the same, yet nothing feels the same. The routine continues, but the meaning evaporates. This is the first tremor of awakening. It is subtle. It is unnerving. It is the moment when the automatic machinery of daily life loses its spell and reveals itself as machinery, nothing more. This rupture does not announce itself with crisis or catastrophe. It arrives quietly, like someone turning down the volume of the universe. You wake up and feel a strange distance between yourself and the life you are living. Conversations feel scripted. Tasks feel hollow. The day unfolds like a loop you have lived 1,000 times, yet somehow never truly inhabited. The world has not changed, but your way of seeing it has. The familiar becomes foreign. The stable becomes fragile. Everything remains in place, yet the ground beneath it trembles with a truth you can no longer ignore. This experience does not signal illness. It signals awareness. Philosophy has known this moment for centuries and named it with many faces: estrangement, awakening, the absurd shock. It is the point where the human spirit realizes that what it has been living is not what it has been seeking. You begin to see the mechanisms behind your own behavior, the repetitions behind your choices, the patterns beneath your desires. You see how much of your life has been automatic, how many of your beliefs were inherited rather than chosen, how many of your ambitions were borrowed rather than born from you. This recognition is not comfortable. It is not gentle. It reveals the distance between the life you perform and the life you long for. And in that distance, something ancient stirs. The existentialists understood this rupture well. It is the beginning of every inner journey, the first crack in the shell of habit. It is the moment when the question emerges that no noise can drown out. What exactly am I doing with my life? This question is not intellectual. It is visceral. It hits the body before it hits the mind. It is not about goals or plans. It is about the truth of existing. It is about the realization that the world is not arranged to guide you, not built to explain itself, not designed to satisfy the hunger you carry. This is the moment when human consciousness meets the silence of the world. The silence is not hostile, not cruel, not comforting. It simply is. And in that silence, we confront the truth that life does not respond to our longing. It does not answer our questions. It does not justify our suffering. The universe moves with indifference, and we move within it, searching for meaning that it does not offer. The distance between our longing and the world's silence is the birthplace of the absurd. But this absurdity is not a verdict. It is a recognition. It is the beginning of lucidity. The life that once felt coherent fractures into two layers: the life you live and the life you expect life to be. Most people never question this gap. They numb it. They decorate it. They hide from it. But when awakening arrives, hiding becomes impossible. The old illusions lose their weight. The routines lose their purpose. The answers you once used to calm yourself no longer satisfy. You begin to see the world without the softening filters of habit and hope. What remains is stark, but honest. What remains is the pure fact of existing in a world that does not explain itself. The shock of this clarity often feels like loss of identity, loss of direction, loss of comfort. But this loss is necessary. It breaks the automatic spell of living. It forces you into awareness. You begin to question everything you once accepted without thought. The structure of your days, the patterns of your relationships, the meaning of your work, the authenticity of your choices. This questioning is not weakness. It is the first exercise of freedom. Before one can choose a life worth living, one must see the life they are actually living. The familiar becomes alien, not because the world has changed, but because you have shifted into a deeper mode of seeing. The philosopher Camus described this moment as the start of genuine consciousness. You wake up inside your own existence and find that you do not recognize its shape. You finally see the absurdity that has always been there, buried under routine. But this absurdity is not despair. It is a mirror. It reveals what you have ignored. It demands that you look without turning away. Many will try to escape this awakening by diving back into distraction. They will work harder, socialize more, consume more, fill every silence with noise. But the rupture cannot be undone. Once clarity enters, it never leaves. It lingers beneath every thought, whispering the same quiet question: is this truly the life you choose? If the answer is no, discomfort grows. If the answer is yes, it demands proof. The absurd awakening is not passive. It is a call to consciousness, a demand for honesty. This honesty exposes how many of our actions are repetitions rather than choices. We wake, we work, we speak, we plan, we chase, all within structures we never created. The familiar routines of life reveal themselves as cages built from expectation and habit. And once we see the cage, we cannot pretend it is freedom. This moment is often mistaken for crisis, but it is clarity. It is the recognition that a human being is not meant to live asleep. The absurd awakening does not come to punish or to humiliate. It comes to free. It strips away the false comforts that kept us compliant. It removes the illusions that prevented us from seeing the world as it is. And once we see the world clearly, the possibility of a different way of living begins to open. But clarity alone is not enough. Awareness is only the first step. The question that follows is the one that reshapes a life. What now? Philosophy answers not with solutions, but with direction. It tells us that the rupture between the familiar and the foreign is the doorway to authenticity. The individual must learn to inhabit the gap, not flee from it, to sit inside the silence of the world without collapsing, to stand inside the absurd without surrendering, to face the fact that existence offers no inherent meaning, yet still insist on living with intention. This awakening is not a breakdown, it is a breakthrough. It is the moment you begin to see that the world owes you nothing, and that this is not tragedy, but liberation. Because if the world does not determine meaning, then the responsibility returns to you. And responsibility is the birthplace of freedom. You are no longer waiting for the world to speak. You begin preparing to answer it yourself. But before the human spirit can answer, it must understand the tension it has awakened to. It must understand the nature of the absurd, not as despair, but as the raw condition of being alive in a silent universe. And that understanding demands the next step into the heart of existential clarity. The absurd is not chaos. The absurd is the collision. It is the moment the human longing for clarity strikes the silent wall of the universe and shatters into awareness. After the first awakening, when the familiar begins to feel foreign, the mind searches for an explanation. It reaches for comfort, order, narrative. It wants the world to speak. It wants reality to reveal its structure. But the world does not answer. It watches without voice, without judgment, without intention. And in that stillness, the truth becomes impossible to escape. The universe is not cruel, not kind, not meaningful, not meaningless. It is silent. And we are the ones begging it to speak. This silence is the essence of the absurd. The absurd is not the absence of meaning. It is the tension between our hunger for meaning and the universe's refusal to provide it. Other beings live without this torment. They act, they survive, they die, unaware of the contradiction. But the human being is cursed with consciousness. We ask questions the universe never promised to answer. We want purpose where there is only existence. We want moral architecture where there is only event. We want order where there is only motion. We want reassurance where there is only indifference. This is why the absurd hurts, not because the world is empty, but because we wanted it to be full of direction, full of validation, full of guidance. We believed that somewhere behind the chaos there was intention. But the absurd shatters that illusion. It shows us that the world does not respond to desire. It shows us that existence cannot be negotiated with. It shows us that we are alone in our search. And once we see this, the familiar mechanisms of comfort begin to fail. Most people never confront this truth directly. They sense the silence, but drown it with activity. They fill their days with duties, distractions, rituals, and noise. Anything to avoid hearing the quiet. But for the awakening mind, silence becomes unavoidable. It echoes through every thought. It appears in the pause between breaths. It reveals itself at the end of every frantic attempt to justify life. And once the silence is heard, it cannot be unheard. The world becomes a mirror, reflecting nothing but the fact of existence itself. The routines that once felt purposeful now appear mechanical. The dreams that once felt urgent now feel arbitrary. The beliefs that once held us feel suddenly fragile. This fragility is not failure. It is the first form of truth. The absurd strips life of pretense. It takes away false certainty and leaves us with the raw encounter between consciousness and reality. This encounter is the birthplace of freedom, but at first, it feels like devastation. The mind resists the absurd because it threatens its deepest assumption, that life should make sense. From childhood, we inherit the myth that meaning is embedded in the structure of the world, that good is rewarded, that effort is recognized, that love is reciprocated, that suffering has reason. But the absurd reveals that these beliefs were never guarantees. They were hopes dressed as laws. When hope collides with reality, the shock generates the feeling of absurdity. But to misunderstand the absurd is dangerous. The absurd is not nihilism. Nihilism declares that nothing matters. The absurd does not. It declares that we want meaning and the world does not provide it. The tension remains. The longing remains. The silence remains. We remain. The absurd does not kill meaning. It kills illusions. And in killing illusions, it exposes the raw materials from which meaning can actually be built. The pain of the absurd comes from confronting our expectations of the universe. We expected fairness. We expected logic. We expected connection. We expected explanation. The absurd reveals that these expectations were projections of our own desires. The universe is not obligated to meet them. The universe is not obligated to be understandable. The universe is not obligated to care. But the human being is obligated to live anyway. That obligation creates the fracture. People suffer not because life is meaningless, but because they demand that meaning arrive from outside. We want meaning handed to us like a gift. We want the universe to justify its own difficulty. But the universe offers no justification. It simply is. And that is where the confrontation deepens. What do we do with a world that refuses to answer us? How do we live when the structure we hoped for is nowhere to be found? Some recoil. They declare that nothing matters. They collapse into despair. But despair is only the shadow of disappointed expectation. Others flee. They hide inside ideologies, religions, and absolute systems that promise meaning with certainty. But these systems often demand the sacrifice of thought, the erasure of doubt, the suppression of one's own experience. They offer comfort at the cost of authenticity. The absurd rejects both surrender and illusion. To confront the absurd is to stand between longing and silence without collapsing into either. It is to feel the full weight of existence without anesthetic. It is to acknowledge that the world offers no answers, yet to continue asking anyway. The absurd does not solve life. It sharpens it. It forces us to look without turning away. It turns life into a raw encounter with the real. This encounter can feel like standing on the edge of a vast, indifferent ocean. The waves move, but not for us. The wind blows, but not because of us. The sky expands endlessly without acknowledging our presence. And yet we stand, breathing, conscious, craving meaning. This craving does not disappear when the absurd is seen. It intensifies. Because now we understand that the universe will not fill the emptiness for us. We must respond to it ourselves. The absurd becomes the ground from which genuine freedom emerges. Not freedom in the childish sense of doing whatever we want, but freedom in the existential sense of recognizing that no external authority will dictate how we live. We cannot wait for fate to choose our meaning. We cannot wait for the world to validate our choices. We cannot wait for destiny to reveal a path. The absurd forces us to create meaning in the face of indifference. It forces us to live with responsibility rather than justification. This responsibility is heavy. It demands that we acknowledge the truth. We are the ones who must answer life, not with words, but with living, not with theory, but with action. The absurd strips away the hope that someone else will decide for us. It leaves us alone and free. The isolation terrifies us. The freedom empowers us. The contradiction defines us. To live consciously within the absurd is to stop asking the universe for permission. It is to stop waiting for certainty. It is to stop postponing existence until conditions become ideal. There will be no signs. There will be no explanations. There will be no guarantees. Life demands movement without assurance. And this demand is what makes human existence heroic. Every step we take is taken against the silence. Every choice we make emerges from a freedom the universe did not grant but cannot take away. This is why the absurd cannot be escaped. It is woven into the structure of human consciousness. The moment we become aware of ourselves, we become aware of the gap between the world we want and the world we have. But this gap is not a curse. It is the source of possibility. If the world defined meaning, we would be prisoners to it. Because the world is silent, meaning remains ours to create. But before we can create meaning, we must confront our reactions to the absurd. We must face the ways humans respond when silence becomes unbearable. We must understand the temptations emerge in the void, the desire to disappear, the desire to believe blindly, the desire to escape the unbearable contradiction. Only by facing these reactions can we choose the path that leads not to collapse, but to authenticity. Rebellion is the instinctive response when the absurd becomes unbearable. After the confrontation with silence, after the collapse of inherited meanings, the human spirit lunges toward refusal. It refuses the world's indifference. It refuses the emptiness of routine. It refuses the quiet terror of existing without guarantees. Rebellion is the cry, no, this cannot be all. But rebellion is not anger. It is not noise. It is the internal decision to reject false consolation and to stand against the inertia that keeps most people asleep. When the absurd strips life of illusion, rebellion becomes the only force strong enough to keep a person from dissolving into despair. The first truth of rebellion is that it begins within the psyche long before it appears in action. It begins the moment a human being refuses to accept the life they inherited. It begins when they stop treating routines as destiny. It begins when they stop allowing fear to dictate possibility. This rebellion is quiet, almost invisible. It is a shift in posture rather than behavior. It is the first assertion of inner freedom. The individual begins to think thoughts they previously avoided. They question assumptions they once obeyed. They interrogate desires they once took for granted. They feel themselves separating from the identity they used to perform. This separation is painful. It feels like treason against the life that shaped them. But without it, no awakening becomes transformation. Rebellion is the psychological rejection of passive existence. It is the refusal to collapse under the absurd. It is the insistence that even though the universe is silent, the human being will not be silent in return. Rebellion does not demand answers from the world. It declares that answers will be created. It reclaims power not by conquering reality, but by refusing to be conquered by its indifference. The second truth is that rebellion is not destruction, it is clarity. The rebel does not burn the world. The rebel burns illusions. The rebel does not rage blindly. The rebel sees sharply. Rebellion is the sharpening of consciousness until it cuts through everything false. It exposes the emotional habits that kept you compliant. It exposes the expectations that kept you afraid. It exposes the narratives that kept you small. Most people do not want to rebel because rebellion costs innocence. It demands that you stop pretending life is gentler than it is. It demands that you stop pretending you are weaker than you are. This is why rebellion feels like stepping into cold air after living in a warm room for years. Comfort shatters. Clarity floods in. And with clarity comes responsibility. True rebellion is not the rejection of meaning. It is the rejection of ready-made meaning. It is the recognition that anything worth living for must be forged, not inherited. It must be created through confrontation, not received through obedience. The third truth of rebellion is that it is fundamentally ethical, not emotional. The rebel does not rebel for the sake of feeling powerful. The rebel rebels because they refuse to live dishonestly. They refuse to betray their own consciousness. They refuse to accept a world that demands sleep rather than awareness. This is the rebellion Sartre described when he spoke of the weight of freedom. Freedom is terrifying because it destroys excuses. The rebel no longer blames the world for their emptiness. The rebel confronts the emptiness and chooses to fill it on their own terms. This ethical rebellion is the beginning of authenticity. It breaks the psychological contract that keeps people docile. Society thrives when individuals obey without thinking. Rebellion begins when an individual stops performing and starts existing. They no longer follow the path prescribed for them. They no longer defer to systems that act upon them. They reclaim the authority to define their own direction. This is not ego. This is responsibility. And responsibility is the only force capable of transforming freedom into meaning. The fourth truth is that rebellion is not loud. That is why most people never notice it in others. A loud rebellion is often a mask for avoidance. People scream because they fear silence. They break things because they fear stillness. The true rebel does not need noise. Their rebellion is internal, deliberate, anchored. They do not seek approval. They do not seek witness. They do not seek validation for their defiance. Their rebellion is self-justified. It is not performance. It is identity. This internal rebellion marks the transition from passive consciousness to active existence. The rebel is no longer moved by circumstance. They begin to move themselves. They do not wait for signs. They do not wait for comfort. They do not wait for permission. They confront life with the understanding that no authority will ever arrive to lead them. They must lead themselves. The fifth truth is that rebellion extracts a cost. A human being cannot rebel against illusions without abandoning the security those illusions once provided. They lose the comfort of clear answers. They lose the consolation of belonging to ready-made systems. They lose the emotional protection that comes from believing the world is inherently meaningful. Rebellion forces the individual into a solitude they did not choose but must inhabit. This solitude is not emptiness. It is spaciousness. It is the space in which the self begins to expand. But this expansion is not peaceful. When you rebel against the false, you must confront the raw, and the raw is terrifying. It reveals the truth that your life is entirely yours. It reveals that no one will save you. It reveals that no external force can dictate who you become. It reveals that existence does not adapt to you. You must adapt to existence. This revelation is the heart of existential dread. It is also the beginning of existential power. Rebellion transforms dread into direction. It takes the fear of meaninglessness and turns it into the raw material of possibility. The rebel learns that freedom is not the absence of limits, but the ability to choose one's response to those limits. Freedom is not the absence of structure, but the refusal to accept structures that suffocate the self. Freedom is not ease, it is weight. The rebel carries this weight with deliberate strength. The sixth truth is that rebellion is the first form of creativity, not artistic creativity, but existential creativity. The ability to shape one's life rather than simply endure it. Creativity emerges the moment obedience dissolves. When you stop living according to scripts written by others, you begin writing your own. You begin imagining the life that does not yet exist. You begin sensing the direction that aligns with your deepest truth. This imagination is not fantasy. It is blueprint. It is the sketch of a future that can only be built through courage. Rebellion opens space for creation by destroying the boundaries that once imprisoned possibility. But rebellion alone cannot sustain creation. Destruction clears the ground, but it does not build the structure. The rebel must eventually transition from refusal to construction. They must move from rejecting the world to shaping it. They must move from rebellion to engagement. But this transition is impossible until rebellion has burned away the false identities that could never create authentically. The seventh truth is that rebellion is not against the world, but against the part of ourselves that surrendered too easily to it. We rebel against our own fear, against our own complacency, against our own dependence on external validation, against our own willingness to accept a life that does not honor potential. The true rebel is not at war with society. They are at war with their own inertia. And once they defeat that inertia, society loses its hold on them. This rebellion is the foundation of autonomy. Without it, any attempt at freedom is counterfeit. A person who has not rebelled internally cannot build an authentic life. They will always be ruled by the fear of disappointing others, by the fear of instability, by the fear of uncertainty. Rebellion breaks these chains. It liberates the self from psychological dependency. But liberation is only the beginning. Once we rebel, we must confront the world not as passive creatures, but as individuals capable of action. The absurd does not disappear when we rebel, but it becomes navigable. It no longer paralyzes. It becomes a condition we work within, not a cage we submit to. Rebellion turns the absurd into a challenge, and the rebel, strengthened by clarity, accepts that challenge without illusion. But rebellion alone is incomplete, frees the self, yet leaves a dangerous void. And into this void rushes the most seductive temptation of all, the temptation to destroy oneself rather than confront the responsibility that freedom demands. To move forward, the psyche must face the darkest response to the absurd, the whisper that life may not be worth enduring. And only by confronting that darkness honestly can the human being step into the deeper transformations ahead. Suicide enters the philosophical landscape not as an act, but as a question. It is the darkest mirror the absurd holds before us. After rebellion breaks the illusions that once sheltered us, the psyche confronts a terrifying possibility. If life offers no inherent meaning, if the universe remains silent, if freedom demands unbearable responsibility, then why endure at all? This question is not morbid, it is inevitable. It is the central question of consciousness when stripped of its consolations. Camus wrote that suicide is the only serious philosophical problem because it forces us to confront the value of existence without decoration. He did not glorify it. He recognized it as the threshold at which the human spirit either collapses or begins to build. The first truth about suicide as a philosophical question is that it arises from clarity, not madness. It emerges when illusions die. It emerges when a person sees their life without anesthesia and feels the weight of existence pressing down with its full force. It emerges when the internal rebellion exposes the void that meaning once filled. This void is not emptiness. It is the raw space where meaning must be created. But before creation, there is the temptation of escape. Suicide becomes the fantasy of silence in a world that refuses to respond. It becomes the imagined release from the burden of freedom. It becomes the absolute refusal of the absurd. But suicide is not an answer. Suicide is the destruction of the one who asks. It terminates the question instead of confronting it. That is why the philosophical exploration of suicide does not encourage the act. It strips it of romanticism. It reveals it as capitulation, not resolution. The human being who considers suicide is not weak, but lucid. They see clearly that life demands courage beyond what seems bearable. They see that existence offers no guarantees of meaning, no protection from suffering, no cosmic reward for endurance. They stand naked before the absurd, exposed to reality in its purest form. And in this clarity, the temptation arises. If life has no inherent structure, why participate in it? The second truth is that suicide appears attractive because it presents itself as control. When the world feels uncontrollable, when pain feels endless, when direction feels impossible, suicide masquerades as agency. It whispers that one final decision could end all future decisions. It offers the illusion of mastery over existence. But this mastery is counterfeit. It is the ultimate surrender disguised as power. It is the refusal to exercise freedom by eliminating the very possibility of freedom. Suicide ends not only suffering, but also all potential for meaning. And potential, however fragile, is the only resource the absurd cannot steal from us. To philosophically confront suicide is to refuse to let despair dictate the interpretation of existence. It is to look at the temptation directly, without fear and without flinching, and to see it as a response to pain rather than a response to truth. Pain can distort the sense of possibility. Pain can narrow the future to a single point. Pain can make life feel smaller than it truly is. But pain is not a final verdict. It is a condition. It moves. It evolves. It transforms. And because pain transforms, the philosophical argument against suicide is not moral, but existential. Suicide freezes a temporary state and treats it as absolute. The third truth is that suicide emerges when meaning is outsourced. When a person builds their identity on expectations, relationships, fantasies, or external validation, the collapse of any of these structures feels like the collapse of self. They do not grieve the loss of meaning, they grieve the loss of borrowed meaning. A self constructed on external scaffolding will always feel fragile. When the scaffolding falls, the psyche feels weightless, directionless, groundless. Suicide becomes the imagined solution to this weightlessness. But the problem is not life. The problem is the reliance on external meaning. Once meaning is reclaimed as internal, suicide loses its seductive logic. The fourth truth is that suicide is often the reaction to a future that feels closed. When a person no longer believes tomorrow can differ from today, existence becomes a loop without exit. Suicide presents itself as the only escape. But this perception of a closed future is rarely accurate. It is the effect of psychological exhaustion. Exhaustion shrinks possibility. It darkens the imagination. It deletes alternatives. Philosophy challenges exhaustion by reminding us that the future does not exist until we create it. The belief that life cannot change is a belief, not a fact. And beliefs can be confronted, reshaped, rebuilt. This is why the philosophical response to suicide is not comfort, but confrontation. Comfort attempts to soothe despair. Confrontation attempts to awaken consciousness. The human being must see that the absurd does not demand suicide. The absurd demands choice. It demands that we face the world without illusions and still refuse to self-extinguish. Suicide is not the logical conclusion of the absurd. It is the refusal to engage with it. It is the collapse before the true battle begins. The fifth truth is that suicide arises when suffering becomes identity. When a person becomes so entangled with pain that they can no longer imagine themselves without it, suicide appears as the only way to end the identity, not just the pain. But identity is not fixed. Identity is fluid. Identity is shaped through action, through time, through self-confrontation. Suffering is part of identity only when we stop moving. The rebel within must rise again here. Rebellion against despair is not optimism. It is defiance. It is the insistence that no internal state, no matter how dark, has the right to determine the entirety of existence. The sixth truth is that suicide reveals the human hunger for coherence. When life loses coherence, suicide seems to offer a clean, final shape to chaos. But coherence cannot be found in death. Coherence can only be created in life. The challenge of human existence is not to escape incoherence, but to organize it, to confront contradictions until they form a pattern, to confront suffering until it reveals truth, to confront the absurd until freedom emerges. Suicide ends this process. It ends the possibility of coherence. It ends the possibility of growth. The seventh truth is that suicide emerges when the self collapses inward. It is a movement of implosion. The world becomes too heavy, the self becomes too small, and thought circles endlessly around the same dark axis. This implosion feels like clarity, but it is actually contraction. The psyche narrows until all alternatives disappear. To confront suicide philosophically, one must reverse this contraction. One must expand again, outward into the world, outward into possibility, outward into responsibility. The expansion is painful. It demands effort, but it is the only movement that breaks the gravitational pull of despair. The eighth truth is that suicide becomes tempting when a person believes they are alone in their suffering. But the human condition is shared. Suffering is not a personal failure. Suffering is the admission ticket to consciousness. Every philosopher, every thinker, every awakened individual has encountered the temptation to escape life. It is not evidence of brokenness. It is evidence of awareness. The question is not whether we face the temptation, but how we respond to it. To respond with suicide is to accept the first interpretation of suffering instead of the deeper one. The ninth truth is that the philosophical rejection of suicide is an act of rebellion itself. It is the refusal to let despair define the value of life. It is the refusal to let suffering dictate the terms of existence. It is the refusal to surrender the possibility of transformation. When a person chooses to continue living despite the absurd, they commit the ultimate act of courage. They declare that meaning will not be given, so it will be created. They declare that suffering will not be avoided, so it will be confronted. They declare that the universe's silence will not define the worth of their existence. The 10th truth is that turning away from suicide opens the deepest path of all, the path of engagement. Once the possibility of ending existence is rejected, the individual must decide how to live. This is where life begins to transform. The question shifts from why live to how live. The absurd becomes a partner in creation. The lack of inherent meaning becomes the space in which meaning is built. And the human being becomes not the victim of the world, but the sculptor of their own existence. Yet before creation begins, something else must be confronted. The absurd does not only tempt suicide, it also tempts escape through illusion. If suicide is the refusal to live, then blind belief is the refusal to see. And the psyche, in its desperation for comfort, will grasp at any promise that numbs the terror of freedom. It will cling to doctrines, ideologies, fantasies, anything that removes the burden of choice. To continue the journey honestly, one must examine this second temptation with equal severity. Illusion is the second refuge after despair. When the absurd becomes too heavy to hold and suicide becomes too final to accept, the psyche reaches for a softer escape. Illusion promises comfort without annihilation. It promises meaning without responsibility. It promises certainty without thought. It seduces precisely because it asks nothing of us except surrender. In a world that offers no inherent structure, illusion offers structure. In a universe that refuses to speak, illusion answers with confidence. And for a mind trembling before the silent abyss, confidence is intoxicating. The first truth about illusion is that it arises not from ignorance, but from fear. A human being sees the vast emptiness of existence, feels the unbearable weight of freedom, senses the vulnerability of being alive without guarantees, and longs for something that can soothe the terror. Illusion steps forward as a savior. It tells us that the world is ordered, that fate is predetermined, that suffering has purpose written in advance, that someone, somewhere, is guiding us. Illusion removes the burden of choice, and in doing so, removes the burden of existence. But illusion has a price. To accept illusion is to amputate consciousness. It is to shrink the mind to fit the comfort of a story. It is to reject the raw truth of the absurd in exchange for a narrative that protects us from the responsibility of freedom. Most people choose illusion. They cling to it with devotion because life without it feels too vast, too uncertain, too exposed. They prefer the safety of explanations over the terror of authenticity. They prefer feeling protected over being awake. Illusion comes in many forms. Ideology is one. Religion can be one. Nationalism, romantic love, career obsession, spiritual rhetoric, self-help dogma. Each can be turned into a shield against the absurd. The details differ, but the psychological function remains the same: to create the sense that life is guided by forces outside oneself, to believe that meaning is not something we build, but something we discover, to believe that existence contains a secret architecture that will reveal itself if we obey the right rules. The second truth is that illusion becomes dangerous because it appears compassionate. It arrives with softness. It arrives with reassurance. It tells us not to fear. It tells us not to question. It tells us not to confront the silence. It gives us borrowed purpose, borrowed meaning, borrowed identity. It allows us to feel anchored without doing the inner work of anchoring ourselves. People drown themselves in illusion because it feels warm. They do not see the cost. That warmth is purchased with the death of freedom. Illusion is the psychological equivalent of morphine. It numbs the pain, but kills the truth. It offers peace, but dissolves consciousness. It quiets despair, but erases authenticity. The absurd does not disappear under illusion. It is merely buried alive, and buried tension always returns. It returns in moments of crisis, when the illusion cracks and reality strikes with double force. It returns when life contradicts the story we adopted. It returns when suffering exposes the limits of borrowed meaning. Then the individual faces a deeper despair, because not only must they confront the absurd, they must confront the collapse of what once protected them from it. The third truth is that illusion thrives in the modern world more than ever. In 2025, we live in an age engineered to distract us from the absurd. Digital systems saturate us with noise so we never encounter silence. Consumer culture teaches us that purpose is purchased. Self-improvement industries promise transformation without confrontation. Social media offers endless mirrors in which we can lose ourselves. Every tool of modernity is designed to prevent the one thing that could liberate us: awareness. Illusion flourishes because it fits the emotional architecture of our time. It is fast, comforting, and binary. It replaces complexity with slogans. It replaces uncertainty with identity. It replaces responsibility with belonging. It gives ready-made explanations for everything we fear. And because human beings crave certainty more than truth, illusion becomes the currency of psychological survival. The price is authenticity. The reward is numbness. The fourth truth is that illusion turns rebellion into performance. The individual believes they are resisting the world, but in reality, they are only replacing one borrowed meaning with another. They break one story and adopt a different story with equal fervor. They believe they are thinking, but they are only switching narratives. Illusion gives them the comfort of feeling awakened while keeping them asleep. This is the most seductive illusion of all, the illusion of autonomy without the confrontation autonomy requires. Illusion not only protects us from the absurd, it protects us from ourselves. The human psyche contains contradictions, wounds, impulses, and fears that are difficult to hold consciously. Illusion simplifies the self. It erases complexity. It turns our fragmented nature into a single, coherent identity, even if that identity is false. This coherence feels stabilizing, but it is fragile. Anything built on avoidance will break under pressure. The fifth truth is that illusion counters the absurd by offering predetermined meaning. It tells us that our role is written, our destiny fixed, our path ordained. This predetermined meaning removes freedom, but also removes fear. To many, this feels like salvation. But predetermined meaning is a prison disguised as clarity. It prevents individuals from discovering what they could become. It prevents growth. It prevents transformation. It demands obedience and rewards conformity. The danger of predetermined meaning is that it makes life emotionally easier while making the human spirit smaller. It replaces courage with compliance. It replaces inquiry with doctrine. It replaces awareness with comfort. In doing so, it denies the very essence of existence, the freedom to create meaning in the face of indifference. The sixth truth is that illusion becomes most seductive when suffering intensifies. When life becomes unbearable, illusion offers interpretation. It tells us the suffering is part of a divine plan, or cosmic justice, or karmic balance, or soul lesson. These interpretations soothe pain, but they also distort reality. They turn suffering into a story rather than an experience. They turn the human being into a character rather than a creator. Illusion explains what does not need to be explained. It narrates what needs to be confronted. But suffering, when met honestly, reveals truth. Illusion blocks this revelation. It shields us from the very experiences that could expand us. This is why philosophers warn that illusion is more dangerous than despair. Despair exposes us to reality. Illusion shields us from it. Despair can evolve. Illusion calcifies. Despair is a beginning. Illusion is a dead end. The seventh truth is that dismantling illusion is painful because it feels like losing oneself. The stories we inherit, the identities we adopt, the beliefs we cling to, these become extensions of our psychological skin. When illusion fractures, the self feels exposed, vulnerable, undefined. This exposure terrifies most people. They retreat back into illusion to escape the rawness of being. But the awakened individual must resist this retreat. They must walk through the vulnerability rather than away from it. They must allow the collapse of false meaning so that authentic meaning can be built. The eighth truth is that awareness is the antidote to illusion. Awareness is not intellectual knowledge. It is the willingness to see without distortion, to see the world as it is, to see the self as it is, to see suffering without romanticizing it, to see desire without shame, to see fear without collapse. Awareness dismantles illusion because illusion cannot survive in the presence of truth. Awareness is a blade. It cuts, it exposes, it frees. But awareness alone is not enough. Awareness destroys illusion, but something must replace it. After the collapse, after the rebellion, after the rejection of suicide and the dismantling of illusion, the psyche stands in a terrifying openness. The world contains no ready-made meaning. The self contains no inherited direction. Everything becomes possible, but possibility without structure becomes chaos. The individual must now do what illusion prevented them from doing: create meaning deliberately. This creation is not fantasy. It is not wishful thinking. It is the existential act of shaping one's life in full consciousness of its uncertainty. It is the refusal to let the universe's silence erase the human voice. But before meaning can be created, the individual must understand what meaning actually is and what it demands. Meaning cannot be imposed. Meaning must be built. And building meaning requires the one force illusion always forbids: inner freedom. Freedom begins where illusion dies. But freedom is not the airy, weightless ideal people romanticize. Freedom is a burden. Freedom is the demand to choose. Freedom is the refusal to hide behind stories that once softened the terror of existence. When the illusions collapse and the mind stands naked before the absurd, a new landscape opens. It is not comforting, it is not stable, it is not kind, but it is honest. And honesty is the only ground from which a human being can build a meaningful life. After despair has been confronted and illusion dismantled, the individual enters the most dangerous territory of all, the territory of inner freedom. The first truth of inner freedom is that it feels like falling. People imagine freedom as expansion, as exhilaration, as empowerment. But real freedom begins as vertigo. The scaffolding that once held your life together has dissolved. The inherited meanings no longer constrain you. The borrowed identities no longer define you. The universe offers you nothing to lean on. And in that nothingness, freedom is born. But before it becomes strength, it becomes disorientation. The psyche searches for walls and finds none. It searches for direction and finds an open horizon. This openness is terrifying because it demands that you become the architect of your own existence. A person who has never known freedom believes freedom means no barriers. A person who has encountered true freedom understands that it means no excuses. This is why freedom feels heavier than illusion. Illusion offers certainty. Freedom offers possibility. Certainty comforts. Possibility confronts. Certainty protects you from yourself. Possibility demands that you face yourself. And there is no confrontation more difficult than the one with the self stripped of illusions. The second truth is that inner freedom is inseparable from responsibility. The moment you recognize that life offers no predetermined meaning, you become responsible for creating it. Not symbolically, literally. Every day becomes a decision. Every action becomes a statement. Every failure becomes your own to interpret. This responsibility is the weight people try to escape when they reach for illusion. They do not fear meaninglessness. They fear responsibility for meaning. They fear the possibility that their life is not shaped by destiny or fate or external forces, but by their own choices. Responsibility is not a moral demand. It is an existential reality. You are responsible because no one else is. You are responsible because the universe does not build meaning for you. You are responsible because freedom without responsibility is collapse. A human being with freedom but no responsibility becomes a wanderer, drifting through possibility without direction. But responsibility sharpens freedom. It gives it form. It transforms openness into creation. It transforms anxiety into intention. The third truth is that inner freedom exposes the self more brutally than anything else. When illusions vanish, when external validation no longer holds power, when the world's silence becomes familiar rather than shocking, the individual must finally confront the truth of who they are, not who they pretend to be, not who they wish to be, who they are, their impulses, their desires, their contradictions, their fears, their longings, their capacity for greatness, and their capacity for destruction. Inner freedom demands self-knowledge that is neither flattering nor gentle. It demands that you see yourself with the same clarity you bring to the world. This confrontation is painful because the self is not singular. It is a battlefield of competing drives. Freedom does not simplify the self. It reveals its complexity. The ego wants stability. The instincts want satisfaction. The conscience wants coherence. The imagination wants expansion. The body wants safety. The mind wants meaning. The more free you become, the louder these voices grow. But inner freedom is not the absence of inner conflict. It is the ability to navigate that conflict without collapsing into illusion or surrender. The fourth truth is that inner freedom requires solitude, not physical solitude, though that can help, psychological solitude. The ability to stand without leaning on others for identity, for validation, for direction. Illusion often disguises itself as connection, but connection is not illusion. Dependency is. The individual who enters inner freedom must separate connection from dependency. They must learn to be with others without losing themselves. They must learn to be alone without feeling abandoned. This solitude is not isolation. It is grounding. Without it, freedom becomes instability. With it, freedom becomes strength. Solitude forces the mind to face the silence directly. No distractions, no narratives, no audience, just existence confronting itself. At first, it feels unbearable. Then it becomes clarifying. Then it becomes nourishing. Only in solitude can a person hear their real desires, their real fears, their real values. Illusion speaks loudly. Truth speaks quietly. Only solitude allows the quiet to become audible. The fifth truth of inner freedom is the emergence of choice as a living force. When illusions ruled, choices were automatic. You followed the script. You obeyed expectations. You moved within boundaries you never questioned. But freedom annihilates the script. It forces you to choose consciously, to choose your direction, to choose your meaning, to choose your values, to choose your suffering, to choose your identity. Choice becomes both terrifying and sacred. Every decision becomes a mirror. Every action becomes a declaration. This is who I am becoming. Choice is heavy because every choice excludes infinite alternatives. Freedom demands that you accept the weight of what you refuse. People fear choosing not because they fear the choice itself, but because they fear what choice eliminates. Inner freedom requires endurance for that loss. It requires the strength to accept that choosing one path means abandoning others. It requires the courage to define yourself through commitment rather than potential. The sixth truth is that inner freedom transforms suffering. Suffering under illusion feels pointless. It feels imposed. It feels like a debt you never agreed to pay. But suffering under freedom becomes participation. It becomes the cost of creation. It becomes the fire that shapes the self. A person who has embraced freedom no longer asks, "Why me?" They ask, "What now?" Suffering becomes raw material rather than punishment. It becomes a signal rather than a verdict. The free individual does not romanticize suffering, but they do not flee from it either. They confront it, interpret it, integrate it. This integration produces resilience not as toughness, but as understanding. Toughness resists reality. Resilience adapts to it. The resilient person does not break because they have stopped demanding that the world accommodate them. They accommodate themselves to the world. They move with reality instead of fighting its indifference. The seventh truth is that inner freedom demands continual self-creation. Freedom is not a state. It is a process. The self must be built repeatedly. Every day requires reconstruction. Every moment requires awareness. You cannot become free once and remain free forever. Freedom erodes under comfort. Freedom erodes under habit. Freedom erodes under fear. To remain free, you must continually return to the confrontation with the absurd. You must renew the rebellion. You must reject illusions as soon as they arise. Freedom is vigilance. This vigilance does not mean rigidity, it means presence. It means refusing to drift back into unconsciousness. It means refusing to betray yourself when life becomes difficult. It means refusing to abandon your responsibility, your clarity, your courage. Freedom demands the strength to hold yourself accountable to the life you are creating. The eighth truth is that inner freedom isolates you from the crowd but connects you more deeply to humanity. When you stop hiding behind illusions, you become capable of seeing others without theirs. You begin to perceive the quiet suffering beneath their routines. You begin to understand the dreams they abandoned. You begin to sense the fear that shapes their choices. Freedom makes you more compassionate, not less, because you no longer project your desires onto others. You simply see them without judgment, without expectation, without distortion. This clarity is rare. It is also unsettling. People who encounter it often feel exposed because they are not used to being seen without illusion. The ninth truth is that inner freedom prepares you for creation. Not creation in the artistic sense, but creation in the existential sense, the shaping of a meaningful life. Freedom does not give meaning. It clears the ground on which meaning can be built. But before meaning can be built, the individual must confront what meaning truly demands. Meaning is not comfort. Meaning is not destiny. Meaning is forged through commitment, through action, through a deliberate shaping of existence. And inner freedom is the prerequisite for that shaping. The mind that is still trapped in illusion cannot create meaning. It can only imitate it. The mind that has escaped illusion but not confronted responsibility cannot sustain meaning. It collapses under the weight of choice. Only the mind that has walked through despair, dismantled illusion, and embraced its own freedom is capable of building meaning that does not crumble under pressure. This is the threshold at which the journey deepens. The individual, now free from inherited scripts and false comforts, must turn toward the next challenge, the confrontation with meaning itself. Not borrowed meaning, not imposed meaning. The meaning that emerges from a lucid, responsible, awakened self. And that confrontation demands everything they have gained so far. Meaning is not discovered, meaning is created. And creation becomes possible only after freedom has stripped us of the illusions that once shielded us from the brutality of existence. When a human being reaches inner freedom, when the scaffolding collapses and the world no longer offers ready-made answers, meaning becomes the next unavoidable confrontation. Not a philosophical choice, not a spiritual luxury, a necessity. Because without meaning, freedom turns into weightlessness. Without meaning, responsibility turns into burden. Without meaning, possibility turns into paralysis. Meaning is the structure the self must build to keep from dissolving into the chaos of infinite choice. The first truth of meaning is that it cannot be borrowed. Borrowed meaning collapses under pressure. It collapses when life contradicts the story. It collapses when suffering intensifies. It collapses when desire shifts. Meaning derived from culture, belief, ideology, or external validation is not meaning. It is compliance. As long as meaning is external, the self is fragile. External meaning can be taken away. It can be disproved. It can be betrayed. It can rot from within. But meaning built from freedom cannot be stolen because it is anchored in the one domain that remains untouched by the world, the awakened self. The second truth is that meaning requires confrontation with one's deepest values. Not the values we claim, not the values we perform, the values that reveal themselves when illusions die and nothing remains but the naked self. These values are not abstract ideals, they are internal demands. They are the instincts that refuse to be ignored. They are the sources of vitality that surge when you move toward them and collapse when you move away. Meaning arises from aligning life with these inner demands. But alignment is difficult because it requires sacrifice. To choose one value is to reject others. Meaning demands exclusivity. It demands commitment. Without commitment, meaning becomes fantasy. The third truth is that meaning emerges through action, not reflection. Reflection reveals the raw material of meaning, but action forges it. A person cannot think their way into a meaningful life. They must live it. They must take responsibility for shaping their time, their relationships, their work, their suffering. Meaning is constructed through repetition, through endurance, through the courage to continue shaping existence even when the results are not visible. This is why meaning feels heavier than illusion. Illusion comforts without effort. Meaning demands creation, which is always costly. A meaningful life is forged, not found. It requires showing up repeatedly, especially when the world does not acknowledge your effort. It requires doing the work that aligns with your deepest values, even when no one watches. It requires accepting the consequences of your choices rather than blaming circumstance. Meaning is not a feeling, it is a structure made of decisions. The fourth truth is that meaning requires suffering, not as punishment, not as fate, as investment. Suffering becomes meaningful when it is attached to something worth enduring for. People who lack meaning feel crushed by suffering because their pain has nowhere to go. It accumulates, it stagnates, it turns inward, poisoning the psyche. But people who possess meaning can withstand suffering because it becomes part of the architecture of their existence. Pain stops being chaos and becomes fuel. Difficulty stops being senseless and becomes formative. Suffering without meaning destroys. Suffering with meaning transforms. This transformation is not mystical, it is psychological. When you understand why you are willing to suffer, suffering becomes part of your identity rather than a threat to it. Meaning gives suffering direction. Suffering gives meaning depth. This exchange forms the backbone of existential strength. The fifth truth is that meaning requires consistency. Freedom offers infinite possibility. Meaning demands selective possibility. It demands choosing a direction and returning to it repeatedly, long after the initial inspiration fades. Consistency is the skeletal structure of meaning. Without it, the self becomes fragmented. With it, the self becomes coherent. People misunderstand coherence as stability. But coherence is not stability. It is alignment. It is the ability to move through chaos without losing the thread of one's own intentions. Consistency requires discipline. Discipline requires will. Will requires clarity. And clarity requires the courage to tell yourself the truth about what you want, what you fear, and what you refuse to become. This internal honesty is the foundation of meaning. The sixth truth is that meaning demands boundaries. Not boundaries against others, but boundaries against your own impulses. The mind wants to drift. Desire wants to distract. Fear wants to retreat. Comfort wants to seduce. Meaning forbids these movements. It requires that you choose direction over impulse, purpose over distraction, truth over comfort. Meaning cannot survive in a psyche without boundaries. Boundaries protect meaning from erosion. They create the container within which meaning can grow. This inner containment is what allows a person to withstand pressure without collapsing. When life becomes overwhelming, boundaries prevent the self from dissolving into chaos. Boundaries maintain coherence. They preserve the integrity of your chosen direction. Without them, meaning becomes fragile and easily corrupted. The seventh truth is that meaning requires solitude in the same way freedom does. Not isolation, but intimacy with oneself. A person cannot create meaning if they are constantly absorbing the expectations, desires, and anxieties of others. Solitude allows values to speak. It allows desires to crystallize. It allows truth to emerge without distortion. Solitude is the workshop of meaning. It is the space in which the self confronts itself fully and decides what life demands next. People who fear solitude cannot create meaning because they cannot hear themselves through the noise of others. The eighth truth is that meaning must be lived daily. It is not an abstract principle or a long-term vision. It is a practice. Meaning grows through repetition, through small decisions aligned with chosen values, through deliberate action, through refusal to betray oneself. Meaning is not a single revelation, but a sustained commitment. The self must show up again and again. The moment commitment collapses, meaning begins to decay. This decay is slow, subtle, almost invisible, until the self wakes up one morning and realizes it has abandoned its own direction. Meaning is fragile only when neglected. When practiced, it becomes unbreakable. The ninth truth is that meaning changes the way we experience time. Under illusion, time drifts. Under despair, time wounds. Under freedom, time expands. But under meaning, time becomes directional. Each day becomes part of a larger movement. Each action becomes connected to a larger narrative. Time stops feeling arbitrary. It begins to feel intentional. This sense of direction is not fate, it is authorship. Meaning allows you to live not as a spectator of your life, but as its writer. The 10th truth is that meaning transforms how we relate to others. Without meaning, relationships become distractions, dependencies, or escape routes. With meaning, relationships become expressions. You no longer seek validation. You no longer seek rescue. You no longer seek someone to fill the void meaning was meant to fill. Instead, you meet others with clarity and depth. You choose relationships that align with your values. You release those that shrink your freedom. Meaning strengthens connection because it eliminates neediness. People who have meaning to live for have more to give, not because they are full, but because they are anchored. The 11th truth is that meaning requires sacrifice. To commit to a direction, you must relinquish other possibilities. To build one identity, you must let other identities die. People fear sacrifice because they fear emptiness. But meaning does not create emptiness. It creates density. It concentrates life. Sacrifice is not loss. It is refinement. It removes what does not belong to the life you are creating. The 12th truth is that meaning demands courage. Courage not as boldness, but as endurance. Courage is the willingness to carry your chosen values even when they become heavy. Courage is the refusal to drift back into illusion. Courage is the acceptance that meaning does not make life easier. It makes life worth the difficulty. Courage is not a feeling. It is a decision. And meaning survives on decisions, not emotion. Once meaning has been chosen, built, and embodied, something unexpected begins to happen. The individual who once felt crushed by the absurd now feels strengthened by it. The silence of the universe no longer feels hostile. It becomes spacious. The uncertainty of life no longer feels threatening. It becomes possibility. The burden of freedom no longer feels unbearable. It becomes the structure within which meaning is created. But meaning alone is not the final transformation. Once meaning begins to solidify, the human spirit discovers another force rising beneath it, a force that does not oppose meaning, but expands beyond it, a force that moves not through creation, but through transcendence, a force that demands the evolution of the self beyond every identity it has built so far. And to step into that force, the individual must confront what lies beyond meaning itself. Transcendence is not escape. It is not ascent into something mystical or distant. It is the moment the self recognizes that even meaning, once constructed, cannot be the final architecture of existence. Meaning gives direction. Meaning gives coherence. But transcendence demands something deeper, the ability to move beyond every structure you have built, to step. Meaning harden into ideology. It is the refusal to let identity become fossilized. It is the refusal to confuse the path with the destination. The second truth is that transcendence is grounded, not mystical. It does not lift you away from life, it sinks you deeper into it. When you transcend meaning, you stop clinging to outcomes. You stop demanding that your purpose be validated. You stop fearing the collapse of what you built. You move through life with a clarity that no longer depends on certainty. The self no longer stands in opposition to the world. It moves with the world. It adapts without losing its center. It acts without demanding permanence. It creates without demanding immortality. This grounded transcendence feels like a widening of consciousness. You become capable of seeing your life from above while still participating fully in it. The third truth is that transcendence requires detachment, but not indifference. Indifference is numbness. Detachment is clarity. Detachment allows you to witness your own emotions without being swallowed by them. It allows you to witness your ambitions without becoming enslaved to them. It allows you to witness your meaning without turning it into a burden. Detachment is not coldness. It is inner spaciousness. It is the recognition that your identity, your suffering, your desires, your victories are elements of existence, not the whole of existence. This recognition frees the self from both pride and despair. Pride dissolves because you no longer need your achievements to validate your worth. Despair dissolves because you no longer treat failure as annihilation. Detachment is freedom without apathy. The fourth truth is that transcendence begins when the self understands that it is not a fixed point, but a dynamic process. Identity becomes fluid. Purpose becomes evolutionary. The self no longer clings to definitions. It no longer freezes itself inside narratives that once felt safe. It allows itself to change, break, to expand. Most suffering arises not from change, but from resisting change. Meaning becomes difficult when the self refuses to evolve. Transcendence welcomes evolution. It recognizes that the highest form of identity is the ability to outgrow identity. The fifth truth is that transcendence requires a new relationship with suffering. Under illusion, suffering feels unfair. Under despair, suffering feels annihilating. Under meaning, suffering feels purposeful. But under transcendence, suffering becomes transparent. You see through it. You feel it fully, but without distortion. You no longer treat suffering as punishment, or as destiny, or as a test, or as a lesson. You treat it as part of the human condition, something to be carried, not interpreted, something to be integrated, not dramatized. This transparency allows suffering to pass through you without corrupting your sense of self. You stop personalizing pain. You stop attaching ego to your wounds. You suffer cleanly, without narrative. And clean suffering transforms faster than suffering wrapped in meaning. The sixth truth is that transcendence changes the way you perceive control. The self built through meaning believes it can shape the world. The transcendent self understands it can shape only its posture toward the world. Freedom becomes subtle. Power becomes internal. You stop trying to bend reality to your will. You bend yourself to meet reality without breaking. This is not surrender. It is mastery. The transcendent self acts with intention, but without desperation. It commits deeply, but without clinging. It invests fully, but accepts impermanence. It moves with precision, but without rigidity. Control becomes influence. Influence becomes presence. The seventh truth is that transcendence creates a paradoxical form of strength. You become stronger, not by hardening, but by softening. Not by resisting, but by opening. Not by dominating, but by understanding. The strongest human beings are not those who impose themselves upon life, but those who allow life to flow through them without losing themselves. This strength is not performative. It is not loud. It is not dramatic. It is quiet, deep, unshakable. It comes from the recognition that nothing the world gives or takes can undermine the essence of who you are becoming. The eighth truth is that transcendence is the beginning of wisdom. Wisdom is not knowledge. Wisdom is not accumulation. Wisdom is the ability to see the invisible tensions in existence and move through them with grace. Wisdom is the ability to distinguish between what must be changed and what must be accepted. Wisdom is the ability to hold contradiction without collapsing into confusion. Wisdom is the ability to live without guarantees, yet without despair. It is the state of consciousness in which meaning remains real, but no longer needs to be absolute. And yet transcendence, powerful as it is, does not complete the journey. It elevates the self. It expands the self. It frees the self from rigid meaning. But transcendence alone cannot resolve the deepest contradiction of existence, the tension between the inner world and the outer world, between personal freedom and the demands of reality, between subjective meaning and objective indifference. To move forward, the individual must confront the final frontier of the human condition, the realm where meaning, freedom, and transcendence collide with the raw fact of existence itself. And that confrontation demands a new form of clarity, a clarity sharper than rebellion, deeper than meaning, and more grounded than transcendence. Clarity is the final discipline of an awakened mind. Not the clarity people casually claim to have, but the clarity that strips perception down to its bone. The clarity that reveals life without narrative, the self without performance, existence without anesthesia. After transcendence loosens the grip of fixed meaning, the self becomes capable of seeing with a precision that was once impossible. This clarity does not comfort, it confronts. It shows what was always there but never acknowledged. It forces the mind to inhabit reality without distortion, without illusion, without the familiar fog that once softened the edges of existence. Clarity is the clean blade of consciousness. The first truth of clarity is that it burns away self-deception. The human being is skilled at lying to themselves, not out of malice, but out of fear. We tell ourselves we are stronger than we are. We tell ourselves we are weaker than we are. We tell ourselves we want what others want, so we do not have to face what we truly desire. We tell ourselves suffering has meaning when it does not, and that suffering has no meaning when it does. Clarity ends these distortions. It forces us to see our motivations without disguise. It reveals the impulses we hide behind morality. It reveals the fears we mask as rationality. It reveals the desires we censor to appear virtuous. Clarity confronts the truth that the self is both noble and animal, generous and hungry, disciplined and chaotic. And only by seeing both halves without flinching can a human being claim to be awake. The second truth is that clarity dismantles emotional illusions. People often believe their emotions speak truth, but emotions speak need, not truth. They speak wound, they speak memory, they speak conditioning. Clarity does not silence emotion, it decodes it. It separates the signal from the story. It shows that anger often hides fear, that sadness often hides longing, that envy often hides aspiration, that guilt often hides internalized expectations. Clarity reveals that emotion is not instruction, but information. When we treat emotion as instruction, we become prisoners of our own chemistry. When we treat emotion as information, we become interpreters of our own psyche. This interpretation requires courage because it reveals where we lie to ourselves most intensely. The third truth is that clarity exposes the architecture of suffering. Without clarity, suffering feels like chaos. It feels random, personal, punishing. But clarity reveals the pattern beneath the pain. It shows how we participate in our own suffering, how we cling to attachments that shrink us, how we pursue desires that contradict our values, how we repeat patterns inherited from those who shaped us, how we choose comfort over growth and then grieve the consequences. Clarity does not erase suffering, but it removes its mystery. It transforms suffering from fate into feedback, and feedback can be used. It can be integrated. It can become direction. The fourth truth is that clarity transforms how we perceive others. Most relationships are guided by projection. We do not see people as they are. We see the fragments of ourselves we cast onto them. We interpret their actions through the lens of our fears. We interpret their words through the lens of our insecurities. We expect them to validate our meaning, soothe our suffering, confirm our identity. Clarity dissolves projection. It shows us that others are not characters in our story. They are entire worlds with their own contradictions, fears, wounds, and desires. This recognition deepens compassion, not sentimentally, but structurally. Compassion becomes the ability to see another person without coating them in expectation or illusion. It is the rarest form of comprehension. The fifth truth is that clarity dissolves the ego's demand for control. The ego clings to control because it fears dissolution. But clarity shows that control is mostly fantasy. We influence, but we do not command. We guide, but we do not dominate. We act, but the world does not obey. When clarity reveals this, fear softens. The psyche stops fighting reality and begins to align with it. This alignment is not resignation, it is intelligence. When you stop demanding that life reflect your expectations, you begin to move through life with precision rather than resistance. Clarity becomes a compass that replaces control. The sixth truth is that clarity reveals impermanence with brutal honesty. Everything changes. Identities evolve. Meanings dissolve. Relationships shift. Suffering transforms. Joy fades and returns in unexpected forms. Illusion resists impermanence. Despair collapses under it. Meaning organizes it. Transcendence rises above it. But clarity sees impermanence as the fundamental pause of existence. When the self accepts impermanence, attachment loosens, fear loosens, expectations loosen. The individual becomes able to live fully in the present because they no longer treat the present as a precursor to something guaranteed. Presence becomes less romantic and more real. It becomes the ground of all action. The seventh truth is that clarity intensifies responsibility. When you see truthfully, you can no longer pretend not to know. You cannot blame ignorance. You cannot hide behind illusion. You cannot justify self-betrayal. Clarity forces you to take responsibility for your choices, your suffering, your direction, your meaning. This responsibility is harsh, but it is liberating. It removes the static of self-pity. It removes the reflex of blame. It turns the self into the primary locus of transformation. You become accountable to your own consciousness, and that accountability becomes strength rather than shame. The eighth truth is that clarity prepares the psyche for equilibrium. Most people swing between extremes: hope and despair, attachment and withdrawal, illusion and nihilism. Clarity stabilizes the inner landscape. It grounds the self without imprisoning it. It expands the self without scattering it. It allows you to hold freedom, meaning, suffering, and transcendence simultaneously without collapsing into contradiction. The contradictions remain, but they no longer feel threatening. They become part of the structure of consciousness rather than fractures within it. Yet clarity, for all its power, is not the endpoint of the human journey. It reveals reality, but it does not fully reconcile us with it. It illuminates the self, but it does not complete the self. It brings understanding, but understanding alone cannot sustain existence. Something deeper must emerge, something quieter, steadier, more enduring. After clarity carves away the unnecessary and exposes the truth with unfiltered accuracy, the psyche begins to sense the final movement of existential evolution. A movement not of thought, not of rebellion, not even of meaning, but of integration. And this integration requires a new state of being that clarity alone cannot provide. Equilibrium is not peace. It is not serenity. It is not the soft emotional balm people imagine when they hear the word balance. Equilibrium is the mind standing fully awake inside existence, without collapsing into illusion, despair, or transcendence detached from life. It is the state in which freedom, meaning, suffering, clarity, and responsibility coexist without tearing the self apart. After clarity strips perception down to its essential structure, equilibrium becomes the final movement in the architecture of consciousness. The capacity to remain unshaken, not because life becomes easier, but because the self has become coherent. The first truth of equilibrium is that it is earned, not granted. It does not come through meditation or affirmation or the romantic hope that the mind will somehow calm itself. It emerges only after the psyche has endured the violence of awakening. It emerges after despair has shattered naivete, after illusion has dissolved, after rebellion has erupted, after suicide has been confronted, after meaning has been constructed, after transcendence has widened consciousness, after clarity has exposed the truth. Equilibrium is the integration of all these movements. It is the moment when the mind stops dividing itself into fragments and begins functioning as a unified force. The second truth is that equilibrium is dynamic, not static. It does not freeze the self into perfection. It allows the self to move with reality. The individual no longer resists change, but neither do they lose themselves in it. They no longer cling to meaning, but neither do they discard it. They no longer seek control, but neither do they drift. Equilibrium is the ability to adjust without panic and to remain firm without rigidity. It is balance without stillness, stability without stagnation. It is the recognition that life cannot be mastered, but the self can be oriented. The third truth is that equilibrium reshapes suffering. Suffering no longer feels like an invasion or an indictment. It becomes data. It becomes part of the ongoing dialogue between the self and existence. The individual feels pain, but does not drown in it. They feel loss, but do not collapse into emptiness. They feel fear, but do not interpret it as destiny. Equilibrium transforms suffering from an existential threat into an existential companion. This does not make suffering pleasant. It makes suffering survivable without illusion. And survival without illusion is the highest form of strength. The fourth truth is that equilibrium transforms desire. Desire becomes cleaner. It is no longer driven by fear or ego or social expectation. It is driven by alignment. Desire stops being an escape. It becomes direction. When the mind is fragmented, desire becomes chaotic noise. When the mind is unified, desire becomes signal. The individual no longer chases distraction. They pursue only what intensifies their authenticity. And because equilibrium stabilizes the psyche, desire no longer manipulates them. It moves through them with clarity. The fifth truth is that equilibrium dissolves the compulsive need for identity. The self no longer clings to labels, categories, or narratives to feel real. The self feels real simply by existing consciously. Identity becomes fluid, adaptive, responsive, not a mask, but a function, not a prison, but a reflection. The individual can step into roles without being trapped in them. They can evolve without losing coherence. They can change without betraying themselves. This fluidity is not instability, it is maturity. It is the recognition that the self is not a statue, but a process. The sixth truth is that equilibrium sharpens perception of the world. The individual stops interpreting life through personal projections. They stop seeing threats where there are none. They stop creating meaning where meaning was not intended. They stop imposing narrative on random events. They see what is actually present rather than what they fear or hope is present. This is not detachment, it is precision. And this precision allows them to make cleaner decisions, form deeper connections, and navigate conflict with intelligence rather than reactivity. Equilibrium grants a new relationship with reality, not romanticized, not antagonistic, simply honest. The individual no longer needs life to be gentle. They simply need to be capable. And capability, once reached, frees them from the desperation that once governed their choices. They stop trying to protect themselves from reality and begin engaging with it directly. This engagement is calm, not because they feel safe, but because they feel strong. The seventh truth is that equilibrium expands compassion, not sentimental compassion, lucid compassion. The ability to witness the suffering of others without absorbing it, without dismissing it, without trying to fix it for the sake of one's ego. Equilibrium allows the individual to see others clearly, to understand their contradictions, their illusions, their wounds, and their potential. This understanding softens judgment, but strengthens boundaries. It allows connection without enmeshment. It allows empathy without self-erasure. Compassion becomes a form of intelligence rather than a form of sacrifice. The eighth truth is that equilibrium alters the experience of death. Death stops being an abstract terror. It stops being a threat to identity. It becomes a fact of existence that no longer distorts the mind. Awareness of death sharpens presence rather than collapsing it. Mortality becomes a reminder of urgency, not despair. A reminder that time matters because it ends. A reminder that meaning is necessary because existence is finite. Equilibrium is impossible without integrating death into consciousness. Once integrated, death loses its power to paralyze. The ninth truth is that equilibrium changes how we move through time. Time no longer feels like a threat dragging us toward loss. It feels like a medium through which we shape our becoming. The individual no longer fears the passing of days. They use days. They no longer worship the future. They build the future. They no longer cling to the past. They extract from the past what is useful and leave the rest behind. Time stops being an adversary and becomes a collaborator. Equilibrium is the apex of existential maturity, but it is not an ending. It is the point at which the self becomes strong enough to face the world without illusion and soft enough to remain human. It is the integration of clarity and compassion, strength and vulnerability, freedom and responsibility. It is the state that allows the individual to live fully in the present without losing direction and to shape the future without fearing the unknown. Yet, equilibrium, as powerful as it is, does not resolve everything. It prepares the mind for the final understanding that existence is not something to be defeated or escaped or explained. It is something to be inhabited with full consciousness. And once equilibrium is stable, the psyche becomes ready to face the last movement of the philosophical journey, the movement in which the self no longer resists life, but meets it directly, without armor and without fear. The universe will not bend toward us. It will not soften. It will not explain itself. It remains vast, indifferent, silent. And yet, within that silence, the human being stands, fragile, temporary, questioning. And it is precisely this tension that reveals our deepest strength. We are creatures who continue even when nothing guarantees our continuation. We seek meaning even when the world offers none. We love even while knowing everything we love will one day vanish. This defiance is not denial. It is dignity. From the first fracture of awareness to the revolt that follows, from the temptation of self-destruction to the seduction of illusion, from the construction of meaning to the quiet rise of transcendence. The human journey is a continuous negotiation with the absurd. We do not escape it. We shape ourselves within it. We do not conquer it. We learn to walk beside it. And as clarity sharpens and equilibrium forms, something becomes unmistakable. The value of life is not given. It is created by the way we choose to live it. The universe may be indifferent, but we are not. Our suffering is shared. Our longing is shared. Our fragile joys are shared. And because we inhabit the same womb, we carry the same responsibility to lighten the weight of existence for one another, even when no final justification exists for doing so. That responsibility is not cosmic. It is human. It arises from the simple recognition that we are all standing in the same silence, searching for warmth. To live well in an indifferent world is not to solve the absurd. It is to refuse to let it diminish us. It is to act with kindness without needing reward. It is to choose integrity without needing witness. It is to create beauty without needing eternity. It is to turn our finite lives into gestures of freedom, gestures of compassion, gestures of defiance. We cannot make the universe speak, but we can speak. And in the vast quiet, our actions become the only language meaning ever had. Living within the absurd is not tragedy. It is opportunity. The opportunity to become conscious, courageous, and profoundly human in a way no perfect world would ever require.